Welcome to Discovering God's Will. This is a 5-part Bible study series that will help you to discover God's will for your life. We will first address and look at some key questions throughout this study. How can I discover God's will for my life? How can I be sure of God's guidance in my decisions? God, what do you want me to do? Practically all believers have asked questions like these at some point or time, especially at critical decision points in their lives. Well, this study will help you to discover how to answer some of these questions for yourself. The key perspective throughout this Bible study will be we will look at God's will as a way of life instead of an emergency support system. God's will is more of a way of life. It's a relationship, a dynamic, more than an emergency support system when we need it. But let's look at an overview of this study. This 5-part series begins with Part 1, the priority of God's will. Part 2 will look at the practice of God's will. Part 3, prerequisites for guidance, some things we need to have right in our lives and some things we need to have as a core foundation before we can actually receive guidance and be in a right relationship to receive God's guidance. Part 4 will be principles for guidance. And Part 5, poor conceptions, ways we misunderstand and have poor conceptions of God's will. So this is an overview of the 5 parts we will look at as part of this study. But let's begin with Part 1, the priority of God's will. Understanding God's will help us to not waste our lives. As we regularly acknowledge God and His desires, our lives will count for something, and we will know His will and His direction in our lives. Knowing and understanding God's will must be a priority for our lives. There are 3 reasons His will should be a priority for us. First, we have an obligation to God. We have an obligation to Him because He created us. We are His creatures. And we also have an obligation because He redeemed us. We are people who have been saved by His grace. So God doubly owns us, and we have an obligation to Him to know His will for our lives. Secondly, we have an obligation to ourselves. We will find the joy and satisfaction of a meaningful existence in our lives only through Him and by knowing His will. Third, we have an obligation to others. Our lives will touch, influence, and affect others as we go throughout our life's journey. So we have an obligation to do it according to the way that God would have us to.